From a young age, Charles Gaines had a knack for drawing. In the 1950s, when Gaines was in elementary school, a teacher noticed his talent. That well-meaning teacher spoke to Gaines's mother and told her that her son had the makings of an artist. Perhaps, the teacher said, Charles could one day be the world's first ever Black artist. Wouldn't that be something? Charles Gaines, the subject of today's episode, shared that childhood memory in a 2021 interview with the Financial Times. According to the article, he laughed while telling it, and that makes sense. This story, particularly the teacher's belief that in the 1950s there had not been a single Black artist in history, is laughable. African art, in all of its diverse mediums and forms, dates back to 2300 BCE. In North America specifically, 17th century art created by Black people precedes the formation of the U.S. government. The 18th century saw the works of horn carver John Bush and portrait artists like Patrick H. Reason, Joshua Johnson, and Scipio Moorhead. During the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, Black American artists like Meadowville Warwick, Edward Mitchell, and Henry Osawa Tanner achieved international recognition for their works. Less than 20 years before Charles Gaines was born, the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Though originally from South Carolina, at this time, Charles lived in Newark, only an hour's drive from Harlem. Suffice it to say that by the time a young Charles Gaines started sketching in his notebooks, he was surrounded by a long, rich history of Black art from both an American and global context. Despite this, the teacher looked at Charles and genuinely wondered if this boy could become the first Black artist. This teacher's ignorance reflects a broader systemic omission of Black artists in art historical narratives. There are multiple overlapping cultural, legal, and economic systems dedicated to cultivating that ignorance. These systems kept Black artists out of galleries, out of reviews, out of curriculums, and out of classrooms. Some of these systems, like segregation, were obvious, but some of them were subtler, almost invisible. Charles Gaines has dedicated his career to creating work that critically engages those systems. I'm your host, Donna Honarpisheh, and this is ICA Miami's Tomorrow is the Problem. This season, we're doing things a little differently. Each episode will explore the work of an artist who challenges the way we have been taught to see the world. Through their art, we'll learn how to visualize the invisible, question the unquestionable, and unlearn what we thought we knew. Charles Gaines began his career as an abstract painter. He studied painting at the School of Art and Design at the Rochester Institute of Technology in 1967. He was the first Black student in the MFA program. Once Gaines arrived at Rochester, he found himself discontented with his education, particularly with the process of creating art. Rochester, like most grad programs at the time, had a Eurocentric curriculum rooted in rigid Enlightenment philosophical perspectives. According to this philosophical tradition and approach to art practice, the artist is responsible for creating a work that comes from within. In other words, the subjective individualism of the artist was central to the way in which art making was approached.
So you did this by, going into your studio and just sitting in a chair and contemplating and thinking until something popped into your head. If you're a painter, you would sit in front of an empty canvas until something, as they say, inspired you, and you'd make it.
This is Charles speaking.
Now, I'm not saying that this is an illegitimate way of making art. I think it's fine. Most of the world makes art this way. Well, a lot of the world. But what I'm saying is that it meant nothing to me. I mean, I tried to make art that way, and then actually the objects, I thought they were horrendous. But people thought they were works of art, and so I could have functioned in the world making objects that way. But I actually couldn't because it was an empty experience for me. The one thing I discovered was that I had no connection to the objects that I made that was a pure function of an intuitive process. the thing that bothered me is that whatever it is that I made or whatever it is that I realized, I couldn't feel like it came from me. It seemed arbitrary and indeterminate.
Thanks to a friend's recommendation, Gaines read the book The Life of Forms in Art by Henri Faucillon, which helped Gaines articulate his dissatisfaction with subjectivity.
I had to read it 15 times before it made sense. That's the first thing. But when it began to make sense, it was illuminating. I mean, I began to see in that book that this principle, that the process of making art is a process of invention, that you have to make something that not is only self-expressive, but something that introduces new ideas into the world. I realized that left to your subjectivity, you're most likely to repeat what you know. You won't be able to go beyond the domain of your understanding if you just work intuitively. The idea that we were taught is that working through the intuition was the best way to enter new domains and new thoughts, new ideas of art. But I thought that it wasn't. I thought that what you would do is, of course, just work within a framework of your experiences and work toward things that are most comfortable. Even if you work toward discomfort, you would try to make discomfort comfortable.
From the beginning, Gaines was interested in going beyond the individual intuition of the artist. His practice was more drawn to the collective, the global, and the system, which is what propelled him to experiment with new artistic processes that didn't exclusively rely on creative intuition.
A system can be used to make works of art, and that I employed. The role of those systems was to make the decisions that normally would be made intuitively. What I saw was that there are other ways of making art rather than ruminating in your studio in front of an empty canvas. So what I did was I discovered that working with systems played that role for me. And the work, therefore, looked very conceptual because I was using numbers and mathematics.
A system is any process that automates certain decisions. Instead of making every artistic choice by himself through the subjective process, Charles created a series of rules and then followed those rules to create the art. Charles's first system-based creation was a series called Regression, effectively beginning his career as a conceptual artist and ending his career as an abstract painter. Regression used formulas to plot out patterns on a paper grid. Charles created the formulas, but the formulas created the pattern. Grids also became an important medium for Charles. In Walnut Tree Orchard, he translates photographs of trees onto grid paper, flattening the image into two-dimensional square blocks. A more recent series, Numbers and Faces, Multiracial Ethnic Combinations, also combined photographs with grid work. Instead of trees, the subjects of the photos were people who identified as multi-ethnic or multiracial. I asked Ellen Tani, an art historian and curator who was photographed for this series, to describe it.
The photograph is behind this plexiglass box. It's encased inside this plexiglass box, and on the surface of the box is this very colorful, actually, grid where the facial outlines are rendered again in grid squares with numbers, but they also are painted with a given color. And so each sitter's facial outline is a different color, and you can then try and distinguish one outline from another based on color as well as numbers. But what's fascinating about this is that you can't actually see the source photograph very easily at all. You have to stand to the side of the work to see the photo, and even then you're looking at it from such a narrow angle that you actually can't discern identifying features or that much information about it.
Grids are intended to clarify information through visualization. Systems, especially mathematical systems, are intended to be these logical ways to interpret the world around us. However, like in regression, Charles uses those very methods and materials to challenge the ideas they represent. An excess of information doesn't translate to truth. Visually translating data can obscure rather than reveal reality.
So the idea of making these systems was really an attempt at trying to underscore how actually rational and logical thinking creates more mystery than it solves. And it's in itself a strategy that allows you to break down the barriers of your understanding and to go into domains and terrains that you don't know about. And I thought that was what it was supposed to do. And in terms of my own practice, that's one of the reasons I like working this way, is that I never know what's going to happen. You know, I put a process into place, and we make it, and we keep our fingers crossed. And over again, I discover things happen in the work that my imagination would have never taken me to, like never in a million years.
Gaines doesn't just use mathematical systems to create art. His work also explores language, creating systems that interrogate meaning by transforming the written word. One of these works is the Manifestos series. In Manifestos, Gaines chooses a political text with significant historical impact, sourcing from the Black Panthers, Olympe de Gouges, the Zapatistas, and more. He then goes through these powerful texts word by word.
So what I do is that I take this text and I convert the letters of the text to musical notes. The letters A through G, for example, are converted to the notes A through G. I also convert H to B flat.
That right there, converting letters to musical notes, is an example of how Gaines uses a systemic process to create art rather than an intuitive one. Gaines doesn't decide how the word justice is converted into a musical notation. He just follows the rules of translation. In fact, Gaines didn't even create this system of translation. It's a Baroque composition practice. But this simple process takes the opening line of the Zapatista Manifesto.
We have been denied the most elemental preparation so that they can use us as cannon fodder and pillage the wealth.
And transforms it into this. Because Gaines does not decide how to musically interpret each word, there is no meaningful relationship between the original text and the corresponding composition. And while the original text has intent and meaning, the composition does not. But as you read the text and listen to the music, you can't help but start to connect the two disconnected pieces. The ways in which you connect them depends entirely on your own experience, your own subjectivity rather than the subjectivity of the artist. Any meaning you find is entirely your own.
I think this produces a certain kind of aporia, that if we think that the idea of meaningfulness has in some way comes out of the intention of whoever produced that object that we are trying to find meaning in, then it's clear in my system that idea of intention is not there. Nevertheless, meaningfulness remains. So we say, well, how come? You know, in other words, it's hard to think that the music and the text are arbitrarily related in terms of the experience, because you keep finding in the music ways of linking it with whatever it is that you're reading in the text.
Critically and commercially, Gaines's art received mixed reception. When he debuted Regressions, there was confusion and backlash, in part because Gaines was a Black artist who wasn't making art about Blackness. At least, not explicitly.
Yeah, I got a little pushback from people from the Black arts movement because it looked like I was making white art, like conceptual white art. But in the mainstream art movement, it was a problem because once the mainstream art world saw that I was a Black artist, suddenly they didn't know what to do with my work because it's not the kind of work that they were expecting from a Black artist.
Gaines's work does not neatly fit into the category of Black art, a category that, to be clear, is mostly defined by white audiences. Gaines's resistance to this category made his art less marketable in the 70s. And, in the 80s, the rising popularity of neo-expressionist painting severely reduced the demand for conceptual art. Gaines, still one of the few Black conceptual artists, took a major hit. Nobody was buying Gaines's art, nobody was writing about Gaines's art, and for a few years, he just stops making art entirely.
He's in this kind of despondent place where he's not quite sure what to do with his art because it's not moving. And so he just starts reading theory. And he's reading post-structuralism, post-colonial theory. He's reading Edward Said. He's reading Homi Bhabha. He's reading Roland Barthes, Lacan, Julia Kristeva, really kind of immersing himself in this kind of theoretical exploration and research. And at the same time, he's planning this exhibition, Theater of Refusal, which starts off in many ways as an outcome of this theoretical deep dive. Because what he's realizing is that postmodern discourse doesn't do a great job of theorizing racial difference and doesn't really provide good tools for talking about the work of Black artists in the way that it provides great tools for talking about the work of white artists and is, embraced very widely at this time.
Theater of Refusal starts out as an exploration into how art criticism excludes and ignores Black artists. But the exhibition evolved after the untimely death of Jean-Michel Basquiat, the now canonical neo-expressionist painter.
And Charles is reading the obituaries written about him, and he's noticing something about the language used to characterize Basquiat as an artist that describes him either as some kind of tragic savant or this drug-addled Black boy. And the very sort of polarizing and racially loaded language that's constantly used to describe Basquiat in this posthumous period and also when he was alive strikes him. Remember, Gaines is fresh from this period of critical theory immersion, right? He's thinking a lot about the way that, language carries implicit meaning, even when it's not mobilized or motivated to make that meaning. So he's starting to engage in a kind of discourse analysis around how the work of Black artists is written about.
During his short lifetime, Basquiat received a fair amount of critical praise. However, Gaines realized that the response to Basquiat's work, while positive, was entrenched in racial stereotypes. The Theater of Refusal widens its scope, with Gaines wanting to explore not just exclusion of marginal identities, but the fetishization of those identities. Gaines reached out to a number of Black artists, including Gary Simmons, Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, Fred Wilson.
And it's a funny show because it is curated in kind of an unconventional way. So Charles wrote up a statement for the show, and then he sent that statement to these artists, a bunch of artists, asking them to respond and select a work that they want to include in the show. So he didn't choose the work. The artist chose the work.
Again, this is Gaines surrendering intuition in favor of a system. He displays any work the artist submits, And this sort of challenges the role of a curator, whose primary duty is art selection. The Theater of Refusal opened in 1993, a month after the Whitney Biennial. The exhibition consists of 3 spaces.
The works included are exhibited in the first gallery space you enter, which is installed like a very kind of traditional art gallery.
The first space is where you see the art self-selected by the artists. Then, after you leave that room, you enter a hallway.
And that hallway is lined with these poster-sized text panels, each of which is dedicated to one of the artists in the show. And on the text panels are selections of quotes from art criticism that had been written about those artists.
And these reviews reveal a racial fixation in the art world that often obscures the art in question. Here's one of the critiques featured in the exhibit.
New York Magazine, written by Kay Larson in 1991 about David Hammons. She writes, David Hammons, who is Black, has explored that foreknowledge state, knowing where you aren't going to get, and has extracted a career from it. He has created an art of marginality, social, aesthetic, political, and sanitary. His scrounge materials are enough to turn your stomach. And then she goes on, and this last sentence is in bold. He's not exactly a total unknown, but neither has he found a way to address marginality without demonstrating it in his own life. The cultural drift finally seems in his favor. This summer, he ended up at the grandest alternative space, the Venice Biennale. So maybe you can see what I mean. Like, there are all of these echoes of the way in which Hammond's work is repeatedly couched in the discourse of marginalization such that it never enters another conversation outside of that in this author's mind.
After that, audiences continue through the hallway into the third and final space, a reading room.
And on the wall of the reading room, there's this 10-foot wide graph. It's charting each artist's press coverage over the years, so sort of historicizing the amount of press they received in a given time. And then there's a library table and some library-ish chairs and a bunch of books scattered on the table on some shelves, as well as binders with slides showing more of the artist's work and books on the artists. So it's got this tripartite structure. There's artwork on view, there's art criticism on view, and there's kind of this research and context space. And this was a really explicit argument that he's making spatially as a curator, because what he found in researching the criticism written about these artists was that many writers relied on stereotypes, both positive and negative, in their writing about the artists, with very little engagement or often dismissive descriptions of the work itself.
The immediate response to Theater of Refusal was mixed. The Baltimore Sun concluded its review with, "Good concept, partly realized, worth another try." The exhibition briefly toured a handful of galleries before ending in 1994, only a year after it opened. However, despite the critical backlash and limited viewership, the Theater of Refusal had a sustained impact in the art world, thanks to its catalog, a lengthy critical essay written by Gaines.
So in the catalog essay, he's really trying to theorize. He's trying to develop a theory of marginality that's not tied to a fixed sense of identity, but rather a marginality that can be dynamic, a marginality that doesn't exist solely to reinforce the status of the mainstream. So he dives into the way that this kind of binary thinking undergirds the logic of the margin and the mainstream. And he says, well, is there a way to inhabit marginality without being complicit in the power structures that uphold the mainstream? Which is a really interesting question. And he unpacks this over the course of this essay. I think I talked to him about it, and I don't believe he ever directly taught it to his students, but this essay has sort of been passed around between artists, and the artists that I've shared it with are always like blown away by reading it because it still reads as prescient.
As an artist, Gaines's work consistently interrogates power structures, and we can see a similar theme when we look at Gaines's career as an art teacher. Gaines began teaching immediately after grad school. His first class was The History of Western Art. By his own admission, the subject was outside of Gaines's expertise.
The whole idea of learning from teaching really started there because, I had, sort of the normal number of art history classes when I was in the university, but I wasn't trained as an art historian. So in order to do that, I had to teach myself more comprehensively the history of art, history of Western art, and taught the class that way. So the whole process was a learning experience, as well as pretending that I knew what I was talking about in front of my students and saying everyday things. All of those knowledgeable bits of information I learned the night before and memorized the notes and then talked to the students as if I had known this for like decades. But I found the whole process very interesting. I mean, it's that the idea of using a class in order to inform and creating that kind of context for teaching, I found that to be an important bit of knowledge or that I accumulated at that time because that's the way I approached teaching from that point on.
As his teaching career progressed, he gained more autonomy over the types of classes he got to teach. But he didn't assume the traditional intellectual hierarchy, creating a pedagogy of care throughout his teachings. I sat down with contemporary artist and Charles Gaines's former student, Edgar Arceneaux, to learn more about Charles as a teacher. And what was your first impression of Charles, of the course? Were you familiar with his work before the course, or was that kind of when you first encountered it?
No, I didn't know him. And, when he started talking in the course and trying to explain what semiotics was and, what the structure of language is, its relationship to, deconstruction, blah, blah, blah.
At the time, Charles was one of only 2 Black teachers at CalArts.
It was like he was speaking Japanese or something. You know what I mean? I was like, I don't understand. But the thing that I got at least on a much more personal level, was that this was an accomplished person who looked like me. And actually, more importantly, is that the way in which he thought about the world and how he approached things were very similar to myself.
Despite its difficulty, Edgar passed Charles's class.
It was most certainly the most difficult class I had at Art Center. It was the drunkest I had ever gotten after I got a B in that class. I was like smashed. I was like, I can't believe it. But it was at that time that we had lunch together one day, either before or after class, and he said, you should consider applying to grad school at CalArts. And I was, of course, I was very flattered by that. But also at the same time, I was like, real artists don't go to grad school. He was like, what are you talking about, you idiot?
And did you continue with him after that?
Yeah, he became one of my mentors. And, and I would assist him in his studio every once in a while, but I would just go and see him oftentimes because I was exploring subjects in my own work that I didn't completely understand. Like, it was like, why am I feeling this way? I don't, I'm having these dreams about this subject. Why am I? And he was always like this surgeon in a way, a kind of a thought surgeon. I would talk with him and he'd be like, oh, this is what I think that you're feeling. And he would break it down and I'd be like, holy shit. Like, that's, like, you know what I mean? Like, then there was like a slit in the wall and then he just like popped it or cracked it open. And then it's like this whole other space.
Edgar is far from Charles's only mentee. In and out of the classroom, he has devoted his time to advising and collaborating with the next generation of artists, including Andrea Bowers, Lauren Halsey, and Rodney McMillan, among many others. As with his teaching, Charles has approached collaboration with a generous spirit. Ellen, a longtime collaborator, describes her experience working with Charles.
just after having had a few conversations with him, he sort of opened up his own art world to me in ways that I found were really kind of remarkably generous.
Both Ellen and Edgar went on to collaborate with Charles. Ellen curated a theater of refusal, and Edgar and Charles worked together on a multimedia piece called Snake River. In fact, his students are partly responsible for the resurgence of interest in Gaines's work.
But for him to have the level of success that he has now and a renewed interest in the work, many of his students, myself, Andrea Bowers, Rodney McMillan, to name a few, we were all very invested in making sure that Charles's work was, if not shown, at least acknowledged, why it was important, how many students that he had impacted. And for him to learn later that Oakley and Windsor was really influenced by his writing as well, and by Theater Refusal when he was curating some of his seminal exhibitions, is a proof to just the quality of Charles's character and how important his work is, not only as a thinker and as a maker, but also just the size of his heart too,
Gaines had a negative experience in graduate school. He once told Ellen that, with the exception of meeting a curator, attending art school had no impact on his artistic development. But perhaps it was Charles's attunement to systems and the way they permeate every aspect of life that allowed him to subvert them in his work and, as a result, provide a better educational experience for his own students. A through line of Gaines's work is a resistance to imposed identity. He refused to make the art that was expected of him as a Black artist. With Theater of Refusal, he questioned whether or not it was even possible to inhabit marginality without upholding systems of oppression. Conceptual artist Stanley Brown took that concept to the extreme. He requested his audience to neither analyze or represent his work. No photos, no wall text, no press releases. He withheld a great deal of information about himself from the public, removing biographical context for his work. On occasion, he even destroyed his own art. Was this self-erasure or a new form of self-expression? Join us for the next episode of Tomorrow is the Problem as we discuss, or at least try to discuss, the subversive legacy of Stanley Brown. This episode of Tomorrow is the Problem is brought to you by the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center and is produced in partnership with Frequency Media. Our executive producer is Michelle Corey. Our producer is Lizzie Stewart. Our associate producer is Sarah Naz Jadbobai. Our scriptwriter and story editor is Isabel Moncloa Daly. Our script supervisor is Jessica Olivier. Engineering, editing, and sound design by Claire Bidigary Curtis. Visual identity by Julian Andrew K.A. I'm Donna Honarpisheh. Thanks for listening.